Hello, it is already December 6th and this is supposed to be my November reading wrap-up video, so clearly I'm a little bit behind on things, but I'm hoping that you will watch it anyway, even though we are no longer feeling the November vibes, we are only feeling the December vibes. And as is customary with fall and winter, it is fantasy month. I read only 3 books this month, but it was all fantasy, and obviously fantasy books just take much longer to read, and one of them was 650 pages long, so the 3 books is very excused. First book that I read this month was A Dark and Drowning Tide by Allison Saff. I've had this on my to-be-read for such a long time. Pretty much as soon as the cover and the synopsis was announced, I was like, oh my gosh, academic sapphic fantasy, I will eat that up. I am so excited, and my book club actually ended up picking this as our November read, so I was even doubly excited because I would get to discuss it with people. Unfortunately, it was not as good as I wanted it to be based off of the synopsis. It's pitched as a sharp-tongued folklorist must pair up with her academic rival to solve their mysterious mentor's murder in this lush and enthralling sapphic fantasy romance. And I don't feel like the whole murder mystery part of this book was actually coming through very strongly, and I saw a part of a review that said Allison Saff cannot politic her way out of a paper bag, and I have to say that unfortunately that is 100% true with this book. The politics were absolutely the worst part, and on this expedition to find this Uro Spring, which basically is going to grant the king leader of this empire immortality, there are 5 academics and their mentor who are all part of this expedition, and along the way the mentor is murdered, and it's up to Lorelei, the main character, who is kind of her mentor's second in command on this expedition, to figure out who murdered her, but then also kind of find the Uro Spring. And I feel like the author couldn't really decide which plotline she wanted to be the main one, and so they both ended up kind of being underdeveloped subplots. And everyone that Lorelei is with, the other academics, they all know each other because they fought in a war a couple years ago when the king, their friend, was crowned. And I wasn't really understanding how they had become famous from fighting in this war because they would have only been teenagers. It just seemed like they weren't quite old enough. They didn't act like people who had already been through this crazy war, basically. They acted like they were college students, you know? So I would have either liked the focus of this book to be on the mystery of where is the Uro Spring, or the mystery of who killed Lorelei's mentor. And unfortunately, neither of them were really super well executed. There is obviously the romance here between Lorelei and her academic rival, Sylvia, and this was definitely the best part of the book. I think my problem with a lot of fantasy romance is that they either don't do the fantasy very well or they don't do the romance very well, and I don't need them to necessarily do both of them super well, but I need at least one of them to be done super well. And when they try to kind of half-see it, it just ends up both of them being unsuccessful. I'm fine with being in a fantasy world with very little plot if the romance is basically written like a romance book but set in a fantasy world, or if it's a fantasy book with a little bit of romance but mostly focusing on the fantasy. And this again falls into the trap of it's not really doing either super well, and I actually really liked the romance, but there just wasn't enough of it to carry this book for me, so I ended up giving it 3 stars, and partly it was because it felt drawn out for the fact that it was only 360 pages, which is pretty short for a fantasy book. Along the way, because Lorelei is a folklorist, she'll just spout like paragraphs of folklore about whatever they're involved in, and I just skimmed them every single time because they weren't actually telling us anything important. It was supposed to be like a world building tidbit, but I didn't really get the impression that it was actually teaching us anything important, and it just kind of felt shoehorned in every time, so I definitely got tired of that by the end as well. Next, I read The Night Ends with Fire by KX Song, and this is a Fairy Loot edition. I'm kind of hit or miss this year on actually reading the books that Fairy Loot sends me, but I was really excited for this one too. I went in with kind of low expectations just because I didn't really know much about it other than that it was basically a Mulan retelling, and I absolutely love Mulan, and I've loved pretty much every Mulan retelling that I've read, so I was excited for this one. And I ended up giving it 4 stars, even though it's not good. Like, I cannot say that this is a good book. It kind of reads like fan fiction, but you know what? I ate it up. That was the mood I was in. I was super excited. The first 100 pages follows a woman named Mei Lin, who is living under this kind of oppressive father, and as a way to escape, instead of marry a man who's going to be just as oppressive to her as her father is, she ends up enlisting in the army, and while while there kind of catches the eye of the prince of the kingdom, and they end up working together to kind of invade this other country. And Mei Lin also has a necklace that she inherited from her mother that gives her these kind of spirit realm powers, and there's this dragon in the spirit realm who is speaking to her and encouraging her and kind of manipulating her. You don't know whether he has good or evil intentions, but you can tell that he's kind of corrupting her and changing her mind and like changing her personality throughout the book. And I really loved the first 150 pages of this. I think the section at the beginning where Mei Lin is in her village and is preparing to join the army, and the part where she has joined the army and is training, is really strong. But I think the second half of the book suffered from a little bit, besides the 2015 style love triangle, which I won't really get into, was that there was just so much movement. The characters were traveling so much. It felt like Mei Lin was here, and then she gets kidnapped, and now she's here, and then she gets kidnapped again, and then she's there, and then she escapes, and then she's there. Like, I just felt like we were constantly relocating so often that it didn't allow the space for deep character development, and I enjoyed the book much more when they were kind of just situated in whatever space they were in for a long period of time, because kind of got to immerse yourself more in what was going on. So I just feel like a reduction in scene location a little bit would have solved a lot of my issues with this. But overall, it was really enjoyable and kind of bingeable, and I will definitely read the second one just because it kind of reminds me of books that I used to read as a teen. And sometimes when I read books that remind me of things that I used to enjoy as a teen, I just hate them. But this was one of the more like nostalgic, it's technically an adult book, but honestly it reads more like a YA, but it was an enjoyable YA. Then finally, my third book for November was The Behemoth, The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. And if you've watched any of my videos, you will know that The Will of the Many is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. So I decided it was time to go back and read his backlog series. And I'd heard from other people who love The Will of the Many that this is still really good, but you can tell that he wrote it in his author infancy and the writing's just not as strong, and that was completely my analysis of it. I gave it 4.5 stars. Overall, the story arc and the character and the themes are very similar to The Will of the Many. It's just not as well executed from a writing standpoint. But what I really appreciate the most about James Islington's writing is that I struggle sometimes with epic fantasy just being confused all the time. No matter how much I'm paying attention, I'm never sure whether I'm supposed to be confused about something or whether I really am just confused and it was something that I missed. And definitely with The Will of the Many, I never felt that. I actually felt like I had a grip on what was going on all the time, and I felt that about 90% of this book. I would say toward the last 300 pages, some things, there's so many names that are very similar. They all kind of evoke the Elven Tolkien style of naming, and sometimes I just could not keep the names and locations all that straight, and I just didn't know whether that was like a continuity error on the author's behalf, because I'd heard that there was some plot holes and stuff, or if I'm just dumb, and you know, it could very well be the second. But this follows an augur named Davian, and he is at this academy of sorts with his two friends, and he is basically led away from the academy by someone right before the academy gets attacked and everyone is murdered. And historically in this world, the augurs were like a powerhouse of prediction and magic, and they were all killed probably 20 or 30 years before the start of this book. And the basic concept of what's going on is that there's this boundary to the north, basically a magical wall that is holding back unknown mysterious enemies, and apparently it's failing. And so in this book, the characters kind of set out with the goal to figure out what's going on with the boundary and perhaps repair it, but really they end up just learning more about the world and their powers and growing in strength as a enemy descends from the north to attack the main city, and all the characters kind of end up converging into the main city at the end, and that attack is kind of the climax of the book and sets us up for the rest of the series. There is a pretty big reveal in this about the identity of one of the characters that I actually guessed pretty much as soon as both characters were introduced. I was like, oh yeah, that's totally who that is, and I was in fact correct. So I have that going for me at least, but it did take the shock value of that reveal away a little bit. But overall, it was really good, super enjoyable, and I am going to read the next one because I have it sitting on my bookcase right now. I just picked it up from the library. So those are the 3 books that I read in November. Lots of fantasy. Let me know what you thought of any of these, and I'll have a little bit of a different genre mix in December. So see you then. Bye.